Death is an unfortunate burden that each and every one of us has to face at some stage. If we're lucky, we'll die old after living fulfilled lives where we did a bunch of stuff and ate bagels. But the world has a shitty way of throwing people in positions where the only possible outcome has to be death. Well, that's true for the most part, because then there are people who are put into those positions, but through their strength and courage, beat the odds and actually end up coming out of that ordeal alive and well. For that reason, I've decided to compile a list of just that. So sit back, relax, grab a bottle of moonshine, and join me for 10 incredible people who cheated death. Number 1 is Pierre Cota. In 1992, Pierre Cota was on his way to a meeting when he got into a car crash. His car was completely destroyed, but he himself came out of the accident without a scratch. Now that's fairly impressive, but we're not done, because Cota was fairly determined to get to his meeting, so he hopped on a flight and took off. The plane actually went on to crash into a mountain. Out of the 92 people on board, the crash killed 82 of them. However, Cota was sitting in the back of the plane, so he had time to jump out of a hole that had been produced from the crash. And believe it or not, he grabbed a young boy who was next to him and saved him in the process. Even after suffering a car crash and a plane crash, Cota managed to escape both with nothing but a nosebleed. Number 2 is Lincoln Hall. Lincoln Hall was a mountain climber who successfully climbed Mount Everest in 1984. 22 years later, in 2006, he took part in another expedition and attempted to climb the mountain for a second time. However, this was much more unsuccessful. He became ill and apparently began to hallucinate because of the altitude of the mountain. His team attempted to rescue him, but after hours of attempting to find him, they were almost certain he was dead. This is because Hall was essentially at the top of the mountain with a little amount of supplies, so they announced his death a day later to his family and friends. However, 12 hours later, another team, led by the famous climber Daniel Mazur, found Lincoln Hall 2 feet away from a 10,000-foot drop, wearing barely any clothes, and unbelievably, he was still alive. Although Mazur's team were only around 100 meters away from finishing the climb, they stayed with Lincoln Hall in order to bring him back down and give him medical help. Hall lost all of his fingertips and one toe, but other than that, he survived and was in a reasonably healthy condition. The fact that he survived in the first place and was still conscious when he was found has baffled many experts, as he was over 28,000 feet up the mountain and didn't have any oxygen, much equipment, and barely had any clothes. Number 3 is Roy C. Sullivan. Roy Sullivan was a United States Park Ranger who in April of 1942 was struck by lightning. He survived, but that isn't the interesting part, because this would be the first of 7 lightning strikes that Roy Sullivan would survive. He became known as the human lightning conductor and owns the Guinness World Record for the most amount of lightning strikes ever survived by one human. Some of the people around him even believed that lightning essentially followed him. Roy was a tough cookie, however. Not only did he survive all 7 strikes, but the last time he was struck by lightning in the summer of 1977, it not only hit the top of his head and ran down his body, but while he was on the ground, a bear approached the scene and attempted to steal the trout that was on his fishing line. So Roy legitimately grabbed a stick and chased the bear away. And according to him, this is something he had done quite a few times when bears approached him. So there you go. I'd personally recommend not hitting bears with sticks, but apparently it works, so who knows. Number 4 is Truman Duncan. In the summer of 2006, a railroad switchman, Truman Duncan, fell off of a moving train and had half of his entire body cut off. He lost both of his legs, his pelvis, and his kidney. Despite this horrific incident, Truman managed to remain conscious and had a clear enough state of mind to call 911. A transcript of the call shows Truman remaining calm and explaining the entire situation. It took around 45 minutes for responders to arrive, and in this time, Duncan called his family and essentially said his goodbyes. Somehow, he was still conscious when the response arrived, and even though he should have bled out, he lived. He underwent 23 surgeries over the span of 4 months, and afterwards, was released from hospital. The doctors described his recovery as nothing short of a miracle. Number 5 is Ricky McGee. In April of 2006, 35-year-old Ricky McGee was found by some farmers living in a poorly made shack of sorts in the Australian outback. He essentially looked like a walking skeleton at this stage because he had been stranded there for 71 days. Keep in mind, McGee had no actual food or equipment with him, and the Australian outback is an incredibly dense and dangerous area. If someone gets lost in the middle of it, especially for over 2 months, they are essentially done for. But Ricky McGee was just about alive when he was found. He had apparently lost over 10 stone since he originally got there, which makes sense because he was eating frogs, lizards, and leeches in order to get by. He was sent to a hospital and 6 days later, he was released. Number 6 is Michael Benson. 49-year-old Michael Benson is a cameraman who was shooting scenes from a helicopter of the Kilauea volcano in 1992. The helicopter crashed into one of the craters and Michael Benson and a film technician, Chris Duddy, were trapped inside of the crater. Duddy managed to climb to safety the next day, but Benson was left inside even longer, and it was only a matter of time before the fumes from the volcano would get him. Luckily, Benson was eventually rescued, and although he suffered some respiratory difficulties, he eventually recovered and returned to a stable condition. Number 7 is the Maine Brothers. In 2007 in Beijing, 2 brothers, Meng Jianchen and Meng Zhanu, got trapped under a collapsed coal mine that was packed with 66 feet of coal and rock. A rescue team attempted to save them but eventually decided it was a lost cause and they gave up. But the Meng brothers didn't. For 6 days they dug through the coal. In order to remain hydrated and full, they were forced to drink their own urine and eat coal. They eventually did get out, by which time they were assumed dead. Their kidneys were fairly messed up from eating coal, but the brothers were in a reasonably healthy state otherwise. Regardless, the pair managed to do what a rescue team couldn't do, and did so with virtually no equipment. Number 8 is Vesna Vulovic. In January of 1972, Vesna Vulovic was a flight attendant on an airplane in Czechoslovakia. She wasn't actually supposed to be on that flight, but there was a mix-up with another flight attendant who had the same first name. As it turns out, the plane she was working on had a bomb on board, and unfortunately it went off during the flight. There were 28 people on board, all of whom died, except for Vesna. Instead, she fell over 33,000 feet to the ground. A catering trolley had pinned her to the plane and kept her in place, so when she fell, she was still in a part of the plane. A German medic found her unconscious and she had a fractured skull, 3 broken vertebrae, and both of her legs were also broken. She was in a coma for 27 days but miraculously went on to make a full recovery. Not only this, but she's not afraid to fly from time to time, and she went on to receive the Guinness World Record for the highest fall without a parachute at over 10,000 meters. Number 9 is Shannon Malloy. In January of 2007, a car crash made 30-year-old Shannon Malloy's skull separate from her spine. Her skin and spinal cord did remain intact, but she was internally decapitated. She was taken to a nearby hospital, but her family was told to say their goodbyes as surviving something so serious would be nearly impossible. However, Shannon wasn't going anywhere. Somehow, she stayed alive long enough to have screws implanted to her skull in order to put it back into place. The nearby doctors said that they had never seen anyone survive something like this, and Shannon went on to make tremendous progress, and she had been described as a living miracle. Number 10 is Jose Salvador Alvarenga. In November of 2012, Jose Salvador Alvarenga and a man he knew only as Ezequiel went ashore in order to fish. They began their trip on a 24-foot boat and intended to work for 30 hours. However, due to weather conditions, the boat began to drift aimlessly. The two were stranded somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, and attempts to find them were unsuccessful. They both survived for 4 months, but it was around this time that Ezequiel gave up hope and started refusing to eat. He died soon after from starvation, leaving Jose in the middle of the Pacific Ocean by himself. After this, Jose considered suicide but managed to keep fighting. He used the little supplies he had to catch fish, turtles, and even sharks, which he would eat raw. 13 months after he originally went ashore, Jose swam to a small island and found a beach house owned by a local couple. He was sent to a hospital where he was treated for 11 days, and he was once again considered a healthy person. Before him, no person in recorded history had survived being lost at sea in a small boat for over a year. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, don't forget to hit that like button. If you're new, you can also subscribe for similar top 10s in the future, but I hope you enjoyed your moonshine, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good one. Haha.